Without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. Originally from Trail, Harry Measure grew up on the slopes of Red Mountain and was very active on the Red Mountain racing program. His passion for the sport of skiing shaped his career goals to become an architect and planner who designs resorts, communities, and buildings in the mountains. He has a master's degree in architecture and environmental design from the University of Calgary and also studied at the San Francisco Center for Architecture and Urban Design. In the 70s, Harry pioneered research into the Kootenay Boundary District's Victorian mining town architecture while enrolled in a master's program in architectural history and conservation. The subject of his thesis research was the architectural symbolism of the Western Federation of Miners Union Hall and the BC Provincial Courthouse in Rossland. That is also the subject of tonight's talk. He then worked with the newly formed BC Heritage Conservation Branch to inventory the historic architecture of the West Kootenay and Boundary Districts. He also participated in the production of Nelson's Downtown Heritage Conservation Guidelines, which continues to guide the revitalization of Nelson's urban fabric. Harry's expertise in resort, recreation, and tourism design and development is globally recognized. And he's also completed, having worked on over 150 major projects in North and South America, Australasia, and Asia. He has also completed numerous projects in British Columbia's mountain resorts and communities, including the Resort Municipality of Whistler, Fernie Snow Valley Resort, and Revelstoke Mountain Resort. Harry has taught and lectured widely at educational institutions and conferences and to interest groups. When not in his living laboratory at Whistler, Harry travels extensively to observe and document emerging global trends in resort, recreation, and tourism design. He writes on subjects related to architecture, design, and cultural history and tourism. A full bio will be available on our website if you want to learn more about the interesting work that Harry has done. And with that, I shall pass it off to Harry Measure. Thanks, Harry. Now, Harry, you have to unmute yourself. Also, I will be screen sharing Harry's presentation tonight. Harry, you have to unmute yourself.
There we are. Can you hear me now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. I mean, at the last minute, this stuff usually happens in presentations.
I'm ready to open up the presentation if you're ready, Harry.
Yeah, one moment. Okay, well, I'm just trying to open the presenter's view. Okay, here we are. Thank you for joining me and thanks for having the patience. One thing the pandemic has given me is a bit of time on my hands to catch up on unfinished tasks. And this presentation really has been in the making. I guess it started about 1975 and the story has never really been fully told. So that's the intent of this presentation, is to, I guess, clarify the unexplained history of the Rossland Miners Hall and Courthouse. So it goes back much broader than just an analysis of two individual buildings, but it goes back to the whole social movement from around the 1840s to 1900. And the first concept I'd like to get across is the issue of manifest destiny, which is on the second slide. Manifest destiny is a phrase coined in 1845, and it's the idea that the United States is destined by God, its advocates believed, to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire northwestern continent. They agreed in 1846 with the Oregon Treaty, and it was an agreement between Britain and the US to establish the boundary at the 49th parallel from the Rockies to the BC coast. Prior to that, that opened up the Oregon Trail, which followed Lewis and Clark's expedition of 1802 to 1805. In the 1840s, immigrants would venture to the West Coast and seeking a better life and homesteading. Then migration was slow. In 1846, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, which ceded Mexico, or present-day California, to California from Mexico. It was from the Mexican-American War that had been raging. Mexico had basically been invaded, and America was successful in obtaining those lands. 9 days after the treaty was signed, gold was discovered in Yerba Buena, which is present-day San Francisco. The gold rush was on. Miners migrated, this is the next slide, miners migrated to the Bay Area, overland by the Oregon Trail, or by boat around the Horn, Cape Horn, a trip which took about 8 months. San Francisco, in 1 year, the population expanded 16-fold. Now, there's two types of mining that have occurred. The initial mining in the Bay Area at Sutter's Mill, where gold was discovered, was placer mining, which took forms of gold panning, sluice boxes, and hydraulic methods. These placer claims were quite short-lived and dwindled, and miners moved on to new prospects. Within about 2 or 3 years, the Sutter's Mill find dwindled, so miners prospected all through California and found gold fields to the north. The other form of mining is hard rock mining, and it's underground with shafts, drilling, and required smelting and large investments of capital. Now, gold, the 1850s, when miners were prospecting, they got as far north as Yale, British Columbia, where gold was discovered in 1858, and silver deposits near Virginia City, Nevada. 30,000 miners migrated to Yale. Gold was then discovered in Pikes Peak near Denver in 1859. Mineral strikes were to follow throughout northwestern North America over the next few decades. The majority of these new ore discoveries required that hard rock mining be applied. With reference to the map, you can see the cluster of gold fields. Red is gold fields and gold town. You can see the cluster in California, and then a few in the Lake Tahoe district of Nevada, where the Comstock lode was discovered in 1858 near Virginia City, and then a cluster of camps and towns and mines. The mines are the black dots in the Colorado area. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't obtain a map that went right up to the Canadian border and would include major concentrations in Montana and Idaho, just south of Rossland. Okay, the mining town development phase is on the next slide. Mining towns originally started with tent structures, lean-to wickiups, or log cabins, often with sod roofs, as in the top left corner. The occasional false front bolted onto a log cabin, but with reference to the next slide to the left, La Porte in the Sierra Nevadas, that's a second phase mining town where frame buildings were built and false fronts were introduced. I put in the La Porte slide because that's where ski racing, the first ski races in the world, were held in the late 1850s, early 1860s. On the weekends, miners would travel between these various camps and hold events, but that's the subject of another presentation. On the bottom left image, we see the makings of a false front second phase town, and then Columbia Avenue in Rossland, which is, pretty well a good example of a second phase town that is primarily wood frame buildings and false fronts. Some architectural elements were put on the false fronts from the east. False fronts were to emulate the civility and sophistication of the eastern towns that most of these miners left. Lawlessness in these towns took on varied and rampant forms: claim jumping, horse stealing, stagecoach robbery, petty theft, forgery, confidence games, drunkenness, and shootouts. I guess in some of these places, not much has changed. Okay, with the next slide, we see the third phase of the mining town, the third and final phase. And that demonstrates in Central City, Colorado, more sophisticated building materials, more permanent materials. Architectural styles are a bit more refined. The houses, residences such as the Maxwell House in Georgetown, Colorado, are quite elegant. A lot of money has gone into them. In the commercial architecture, such as in Leadville in the lower three images, fairly sophisticated architecture such as Second Empire and Italianate are evident. And Romanesque buildings such as the center image. To the right, the Tabor Opera House in Leadville, Colorado is a good example of when mining towns feel they've made it, they've reached that of the East, to have an elegant opera house. Okay, with the next slide, a new building type introduced to these mining camps and towns is the Miners Union Hall. Now, Miners Union Halls had never really been designed before or built because they're a new phenomenon. So they vary in style. And miners' unions were important to combat the unsafe and unsanitary conditions in the mines, maintain a fair wage, and provide social services for miners and their families, such as support of miners killed in industrial accidents. Miners' protective associations were formed as early as the late 1850s at the Comstock mine in Virginia City, Nevada. So they needed a place to meet and I guess recreate, but these buildings also served as meeting centers for social events for the community. Many offered ballrooms and stages for special events and provided facilities for fraternal organizations such as the Knights of Pythias. The Miners Union Hall in Bodie, California, even offered a library, as later did Rossland's, with a membership of 50 cents. Okay, with reference to the next slide, the miners' unions were essential. This poster during the Colorado labor wars of 1903 to 1904 describes the injustices from mine owners and collusion with government the miners had endured since the early days of the Comstock mine. Numerous strikes in the metalliferous camps of North America had dated back to Virginia City, Nevada, but the strikes in Colorado and the Coeur d'Alene district of Idaho had the most impact upon government and mine owners' policies in the West Kootenai district. Underground miners were paid $3 a day, but would strike for $3.50 in good times, or to prevent a kind of $2.50 in bad times. Mine owners would then import scab labor protected by armed guards to break the strike. A battle would ensue, and the governor would call out troops to suppress the strikers. Miners' unions were widely regarded by government officials, as well as mine owners, as dangerous groups of foreign anarchists. And the list on the red, white, and blue stars and stripes of issues are pretty well factual. Unfortunately, there's been so much research available with the internet now versus 40, 5 years ago that, oh boy, I've got a stack of papers on my desk for notes. Okay, so with the next slide, there's two significant labor wars that really do impact Rossland. The Coeur d'Alene Labor War of 1892 and 1899. In 1892, mine owners got into a dispute over increased freight rates with the rail system. The Bunker Hill and Sullivan mine owners lowered miners' wages and increased hours from 9 to 10 hours a day and for 7 days a week. The miners went on strike. Mine owners responded by hiring non-union strikebreakers from Michigan and armed guards to protect them. Mine owners put a Pinkerton spy in as a union secretary worker at the Bunker mine. Riots broke out between union workers and company guards. Several men were killed by company guards. And the strikers then disarmed the guards and marched more than 100 strikebreakers out of town. The governor of Idaho, Steunenberg, asked President Benjamin Harrison for troops. Harrison declared martial law and sent troops to restore order. 600 officers, members, and sympathizers, or 600 union officers, members, and sympathizers are arrested and put in bullpens without the right to trial, bail, or habeas corpus. Non-union workers return to the mine and are provided with military protection. Well, the mine owners discharge any union members they rehired. Then in 1893, the Western Federation of Miners is formed in Butte, Montana. We'll get on to that soon. In 1894, during the Pullman Railway strike, union miners went on strike to support railway union members and attacked non-union miners and workers, murdering John Kneebone, a non-union miner who had testified against the union miners in a trial following the uprising in 1892. Mine workers, or mine owners had Governor Steunenberg call in state troops. President Leyland sent 700 troops to keep the railways open. Because the troops didn't interfere, just kept the railways open, miners withdrew, not wanting another bullpen incident. In the strike of 1892, they spent months in these makeshift prisons, stockades, without any hope of fair hearing. The Bunker Hill and Sullivan mines shut down rather than agree to a $3.50 wage. Mines reopened, paying $3 to underground and $2.50 to above ground workers, promising to restore wages once lead and silver prices improved. Miners were running at a point. Mines were running at a profit with lesser paid workers. In 1899, the union launched a drive to organize the few locals that were not unionized. 17 miners to be union members were fired at Wardner, and the union struck. The strike at Wardner wasn't succeeding, so union miners at nearby Western Federation locals at Jan, Burke, and Mullen feared their wages would be cut as well. So they seized a railway train and took it to the Bunker Hill mine at Wardner. They detonated 500 boxes of dynamite, 1,300 pounds, or 50 boxes of dynamite, approximately 1,300 pounds, under one of the world's largest mining concentrators, destroying the facility and murdering 2 non-union miners who were fleeing the scene. Federal troops were sent to the Coeur d'Alene region from Spokane, Salt Lake City, and other Western posts. 1,000 men, not just miners, but lawyers, couple politicians, even a sheriff, were indiscriminately arrested, rounded up, and put in another bullpen. This is in 1899, after the 1892 bullpen. Troops then tracked Union miners into Montana and elsewhere. Many fled to the Kootenai mining camps, and this was in 1899, a very significant time. 10 Union members were convicted, and 3 were acquitted on charges of conspiracy and stopping a mail train. Okay, with the next slide. So back to 1893, the Western Federation of Miners was formed because of the, I guess, injustices of the 1892 strike and incarceration in the bullpen. Many of those miners that were responsible for forming the Western Federation of Miners were actual prisoners. 45 unions from the state, from Colorado, Utah, Montana, and Idaho met and formed Western Federation of Miners Local Number 1.
But I'm not eating, and there's no noise I can hear.
So,
because I can move it much closer.
okay. So in the early 1880s, prospectors from the Coeur lands discovered mineral-rich several deposits on Kootenai Lake near Ainsworth Hot Springs. This led to a large influx of American miners crossing the border into the West Kootenai and Boundary districts. Mineral-rich deposits were discovered on the slopes of Red Mountain in the 1880s, and hard rock mining enterprises developed with capital of a Spokane that had become the financial center for the Butte and Coeur d'Alene mines. The heritage of conflict between the miners and powerful mine owners during the decades before followed into the new BC camps. Local 38, which was Local 38, which was the first international Western Federation of Miners local, was formed in Rosslyn, as I said, in 1895. Like its predecessors, a hall was to be the center for Local 38 and also to serve as a community amenity. Here we see the center star head frame in operation. It did take significant capital to hard rock mine. On the bottom left image is a miners' hall that was completed in 1898. And the inside, to the next image, is an event, could be the 4th of July, but at the turn of around 1895, Rosslyn was pretty well 100% Americans. Okay, with the next slide, we have images of the Miners Union Hall. And in Parks Canada's designation of the hall as a National Historic Site in July 2019, Parks Canada stated that the hall is, quote, a rare surviving building of this type in Western Canada. This is eclectic wooden late Victorian Gothic revival style building serves as a major landmark for the community. It is an eclectic or high Victorian building built during the late Victorian era, which started in 1893 with the Chicago World's Fair. But no such style as late Victorian Gothic existed. The local 38 hired E.J. Weston to design it. Now, Weston was a Los Angeles-based architect who had just completed the design of the Bloomington Congregational Church between 1895 and 1896. It was located in San Bernardino Valley, east of LA. The church was designed in the Spanish colonial or mission style that was popular in Southern California because it was appropriate to the climate, incorporates local building materials and construction techniques, and references the settlement history of the region. An established regionalism in architectural style that Weston was able to apply to the Bloomington Church had not yet been developed in the Rosslyn context. Weston took the eclectic approach to assembling the architectural imagery for the Rosslyn Hall by borrowing imagery from the Swiss chalet that referenced the mountain context and responded to the heavy snowfalls. and the Greek revival styles that were popular during the early and mid-Victorian periods. The Swiss chalet style first gained attention at the end of the 18th century in Europe among the Romantic era writers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and early 19th century in the writings and drawings of Romantic period artists and writers such as Violet Leduc and British architecture critic and writer and painter John Ruskin. The Swiss chalet had several periods of popularity in North America in the second half of the 19th century. The style was popularized in North America in 1850 with the publication of Andrew Jackson Downing's book, The American Country House, that advocated the Swiss pastoral lifestyle and simple chalet as a lifestyle in America. And later in the introduction of a stick style that had its roots in the Swiss chalet style of the 1850s. The style was also popular in mountainous areas and resorts for use as inns, restaurants, and rustic lodges. The Swiss chalet style was later one of the stylistic inspirations of the bungalow craftsman style that emerged in California in the early 20th century. At the time, the Western Federation of Miners Local 38 Union Hall was to be designed. Publications in the United States featured rustic European, Swiss Alpine inspired architecture, such as Sagamore Lodge. It was completed in 1897. It was started in 1895 at the Great Camp Sagamore in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. Now, this Sagamore Lodge would have been published in all the architectural magazines of the day, so I assume Weston would have probably come across it. Now, elements of the Swiss style include typically rectilinear, squarish, and 2.5 stories in height. A pitched roof with front gables and wide eaves, usually with brackets or exposed rafter tails. Balcony and balustrades the balconies and balustrades eventually morphed into second-story porches, a balcony, or a simple decorative effect. So on the bottom, below the images of the Miners Hall, is the original Aryan chalet that came to the Alps from the Himalayas originally. And then in the center image is a traditional Swiss chalet. And then to the right is a chalet in America with scroll work. There's a lot of jigsaw scroll work in the barge boards, on the fascia boards, and you can see scroll work bands across the facade at the same elevation of the balcony. Okay, in the next slide, here we have details of the Miners Hall. And I mentioned Greek revival earlier. To establish the appearance of an institutional architecture and to create a temple of labor, Weston adopted architectural elements from the symmetrical temples of classical Greece. The Greek revival style in North America was very popular in the design of institutional buildings in the early Victorian period that lasted from approximately 1840 to 1910. The Miners Union Hall has Hall's facade. In the Miners Hall facade, he maintained the symmetry of the temple in his articulation and applied pediments, those triangular elements, from the temple above the windows and main door. And the right-hand element, you see the windows with pediments, you see the same element above in the Miners Union Hall. The image on the lower right-hand corner is a residential building in Romania. So it's quite common, in the Western world, this detail. Okay, with the next slide, with labor unrest and frequent strikes in Western mountain states during the 1890s, that was organized by the Western Federation of Miners. By 1898, the mine owners of Rosslyn Okay, mine owners of Rossland, the municipal and provincial governments, and repressive capitalists that dominated the industry had cause for great concern. Here we see, sorry, I have to back up a bit. The balcony was a bit of an urban gesture for public spaces based on platforms in Europe. Back to what was going on about the labor arrest. Many of the Kootenai camps were full of veterans of the Coeur d'Alene conflict and focused on spreading the Western Federation's increasingly revolutionary socialist doctrine based on hardline Marxism. Causing further concern to the mine owners and government, the labor-friendly, this is by 1898, the labor-friendly Charles Semlin was appointed premier by the lieutenant governor in 1898. By now, Rossland and Nanaimo union members had seized positions in the legislature as MLAs. One of the first pieces of legislation to be drafted by the Semlin government was the 8-Hour Day Act that the Western Federation of Miners was responsible for instilling in many of the Western US states. BC had its own heritage of conflict between the coal miners of Vancouver Island, the mine owners, and the BC government, to add to the concern of the mine owners and capitalist power brokers of the province. Okay, with reference to the next slide, one of the power brokers that most influenced BC's economy was Robert Dunsmeer. His family business was engaged in the coal mines in his native Ayrshire of Scotland, but at 20 years old, he signed up with the Hudson Bay Company in 1850 to exploit coal findings at Fort Rupert on Vancouver Island. The Fort Rupert mine was a struggle. But in 1852, he was reassigned to Nanaimo, where a new seam had been discovered. He was assigned there to open up this new discovery of a very major coal field. In 1850 or 69, while fishing, he discovered the Wellington deposit and applied for the mine license to develop it himself. By 1873, his Wellington colliery produced 16,000 tons of the 40,000 tons produced on Vancouver Island. By 1875, Dunsmir was producing 50,000 tons per year for two principal markets, San Francisco and the Royal Navy, that was based at Esquimalt near Victoria. By 1883, the company was producing $500,000 a year in coal. He founded the Nanaimo Esquimalt Railway after receiving a grant of land comprising 20% of Vancouver Island to do so. He was elected to the BC legislature representing Nanaimo in 1882 election and re-elected in 1886. He built a conglomerate of related companies that included a steamship line, a railway, and a range of enterprises that from the Albion Ironworks to the daily British colonists. For a miner that started at $5 a week for the Hudson Bay Company in 1850, 38 years later, he was worth $15 million at the time, which is approximately $427 million today. We see the Esquimalt Nanaimo Railway in the top right image. And then he built between 1885 and 1890, Craig Derrick Castle in Victoria, his home, which is based on Jacobean, Scottish baronial, and French Gothic chateau elements. It was designed by Smith and Williams architects out of Portland and features Roman arches, corbelled turrets, dormers, balconies, oriels, and tall Elizabethan chimneys. And then another important power broker in BC is his son, James Dunsmeer. And he was, James Dunsmeer, as mentioned, his family dominated BC's economy in the late 19th century. He managed the family coal business from 1876, when he took over from his father, Robert, until 1910. He won a seat in the BC legislature in 1898, which is interesting. He ran because the Sumlin government was getting in, and because the Nanaimo and Rossland miners had established MLAs in the provincial legislature. He became the 14th premier in the election of 1900. In 1906, he became BC's 8th lieutenant governor, retiring in 1909. James Dunsmeer, in addition to Robert, was a leading force in opposing organized labor, violently putting down efforts to unionize. In 42 years, the Dunsmeers owned the collieries. They never recognized their employees' attempts to unionize or create better working conditions. They used threats, spies, blacklists, scab labor, all to break strikes. When scab labor was ineffective, he used his influence to have the BC government call in the militia. Their efforts, the Dunsmir Empire contributed to BC coal mines being among the most dangerous in the world. Mine owners regularly ignored safety and sanitary conditions, and government inspectors did not enforce standards. From 1889 to 1908, 20 men were killed for every 1 million tons of coal. The average for North America as a whole was 6 deaths per million. In 1901, while serving as premier, many men perished in his collieries. His government attempted to resist popular pressure to stop Asian labor and immigration for non-humanitarian reasons, but to ensure a cheap labor pool for business. We see here Haley Park, his residence in a squimalt overlooking a squimalt harbor, placed on 650 acres. So from this castle, he could look down on the family yacht, Delura, that was anchored in the Esquimalt harbor. Okay, with reference to the next slide, the Dunsmeers and mine owners in the coal fields had over 40 years history of conflict with labor. Prior to the discovery of coal on Vancouver Island, the Hudson Bay Company workers had no unions, but strike would also be held to improve working conditions. In 1850, the seven Scottish miners imported to work the Fort Rupert claim went on strike for better working conditions. 2 were put in leg irons. The remainder, actually Dunsmir, one of the 7 miners, didn't strike. But the remainder of the miners stowed away on ships to the California gold fields. For his loyalty to the Hudson Bay Company, Dunsmeer was given 1,000 acres of coal rights to develop in the Nanaimo fields. In 1869, Robert Dunsmeer discovered the first Wellington pit, and as mentioned previously, in 1883, he built the ENN Railway and was granted land totaling 20% of Vancouver Island. Okay, you can see some of the conditions. These are all mines located in the Nanaimo area. Okay, with reference to the next slide, by 1883, the Wellington pit produced 83% of BC coal. Vancouver Island coal towns of Ladysmith, Wellington, and Nanaimo, and Cumberland experienced class tensions that led to a major strike in 1877, 1890, and 1912. The most bitter strikes broke out against the Dunsmeers in 1877, 1888, 1889 was a lockout, in 1890, 1903, and 1912, and lasted months and even years. Strikes were over issues such as safety conditions, union recognition, better wages, control over way stations, and high prices at the company's store. As mentioned earlier, mines on Vancouver were among the most dangerous in the world. Between 1888 and 1913, an average of 27 miners were killed each year. In 1887, 148 men died in a mining accident, followed by 77 more in 1888. The average deaths in North America, as mentioned, coal mines per 1 million tons of coal was 6, while the Dunsmeers was 24 deaths. We see images of the Dunsmir mines around the Nanaimo area. Okay, with reference to the next slide, here we see the militia in the Nanaimo strike of 1890 to 91. Typically, when a dispute arose, the company's policy was effective. Immediately evict miners and their families from company houses, bring in special constables and/or militia and strikebreakers. In addition to mass evictions and arrests, for example, 250 miners in 1913, riots, gun battles, and deportation of strikers occurred. The government actively and openly supported the mine owners. When the militia was called out during the 1890 strike, it was the outcome of considerable collusion between the company and the government, even though by 1890, Nanaimo miners had 2 MLAs from Nanaimo in Victoria. The miners confronted not just the company, but an alliance between the employer and the state. Government, who had close ties to the Dunsmir, had to make a strong statement of British parliamentary law through the construction of an imposing courthouse in Nanaimo. Okay, now, if we turn to the next slide, we'll see the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. And with the formation of the Dominion of Canada, the Parliament buildings of Ottawa were designed in the Gothic Revival style, as were the Houses of Parliament in England, but with some elements from the French Gothic style included to convey Canada's unique French heritage. They believed it was the Gothic style and its association with Britain was the best reference to parliamentary democracy, as opposed to the popular neoclassical styles in the States that were identified with American republicanism. Excuse me. Once the sale of Rupert's land was completed in 1870, Canada was able to pursue its own manifest destiny and expand westward. The CPR was financed through the Bank of Montreal and began in 1878 to unite Canada from coast to coast with the construction of the railroad that was completed by 1885. And the completion of the railway was one of the issues for BC to join in the Confederation. Now, to express the French heritage of the province, the Quebec City Armory of 1887 borrowed from the Chateau style in France. This government building was the first to be executed in the Chateau style in Canada, the French Chateau style. Okay, with reference to the next slide, we see 4 castles, and these are chateaus. The chateau style found its inspiration in the 13th and 14th century castles in France's Loire River Valley that were initially fortresses placed to defend rather than as residences. The style came later to designate any seigneurial residence and so generally a country house. They in effect became palaces. Architectural elements of the style include steeply sloping roofs, large dormers, turrets, towers, and crenellated parapets. Okay, with reference to the next slide, we see a series of CPR railway hotels. And as mentioned, the condition of confederation was the completion of the CPR to the West Coast. To supplement freight hauling profits, a chain of railway hotels oriented to tourists was constructed constructed in the late 1880s onwards. And here we see the first CPR hotel in Field, BC, and one in Glacier in the Rogers Pass. Now, these were wooden structures and not of the chateau style, but as the structures grew bigger, the CPR embraced the chateau style and built hotels such as the Banff Springs. Now, this is the second Banff Springs. The first one burned down. The Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, and Hotel Vancouver, the first one being 1888. With reference to the next slide, other influences on Canada's chateau-style architecture were the more contemporary Richardsonian Romanesque that really was founded or developed by an architect named Henry Hobson Richardson, who was the second US architect to receive training at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris during the 1860s. He dominated North American architecture during the latter years of the 19th century. Richardsonian Romanesque is based on the style of southern France, for example, the chateau style, but freely incorporated other elements and styles from history. Characteristics of the style include heavy massings, building massings, picturesque roofline profiles, rustication, polychromy, various colors, semicircular arches, Romanesque arches, supported on clusters of squat columns, and round arches over clusters of windows on massive walls. Richardson achieved notable merits in 4 building types: public libraries, commuter train station, and single-family residences. Here we see some of the various buildings he completed as he was evolving his style. So, in search of a style and imposing courthouse for Nanaimo, Francis Mawson Rattenbury was hired as the architect. Francis Mawson Rattenbury became BC's premier institutional architect from the time, at age 25, he won the competition for the BC Parliament buildings in 1892, to the collapse of pre-war expansion in 1918. He was pretty well the top architect. Rattenbury was born in Leeds, England, and began his apprenticeship in 1884 at his uncle's firm, Lockwood and Mawson, until he departed for Vancouver in 1891. He won the competition in 1892, as previously mentioned. The BC Parliament buildings opened in 1898 and exhibits a Romanesque revival style that was popular at the time in government buildings, as well as with railway hotels. He was a very big fan of Henry Hobson Richardson, and he is one of the few Canadian architects that really applied it. His success led to the design of many other buildings in Victoria and elsewhere. He designed courthouses, bank buildings, shipping terminals, hotels, and railway stations throughout BC. He was the Canadian Pacific Railway's Western Division architect and designed the Chateau Empress Hotel, as we see in the bottom image. He was also at the time the Grand Trunk Railway's architect and on the board of directors, and designed a series of their luxury hotels. And we see the Bank of Montreal in Victoria, which is considered as best execution or application of the Chateauesque style. The top, the courthouse, the BC Parliament buildings, they're heavily Richardsonian Romanesque in appearance, but they also use a Beaux-Arts dome borrowed from Delhi, India, the Parliament buildings there, which was a strong British statement of British law in the empire. With reference to the next slide, we see where he had also designed the BC Courthouse in Nelson, completed in 1899, the Bank of Montreal in Nelson in 1898, Bank of Montreal in Rosslyn in 1900, and the Vancouver Courthouse. In other schemes, such as the Vancouver Courthouse, CPR Shipping Terminal, Crystal Gardens, and Bank of Montreal and Nelson Rosslyn, he expresses the Beaux-Arts style that had become more popular in North America with its introduction at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. So popular taste had shifted after 1893 elsewhere for the Beaux-Arts style. Okay, with reference to the next slide, here we see images of the Nanaimo Provincial Courthouse. And it's a very, very heavily influenced Richardsonian Romanesque building with a chateau roof on it. The building, to be imposing within Nanaimo and the volatile environment, it's positioned on a height of land overlooking the inner harbor, much like a chateau in the Loire River Valley, positioned as a fortress over the Loire River. With reference to the middle image in the bottom, it's positioned next to the Nanaimo Courthouse, which is also done in a French chateau style. A lot of public buildings were at the time. Then we see some of the detailing in the bottom corner of the courthouse. Okay, with reference to the next slide, the interior of the courthouse goes further to establish BC's link with Canada and parliamentary law and French Canada, with some of the detailing such as the fleur-de-lis tiling. Okay, so with reference to the next slide, which is images of Rossland, we see the Rosslyn Courthouse, which strongly resembles the Nanaimo Courthouse. It's located at the end of Columbia Avenue, Main Street, on a corner lot. Ideally, courthouses were to be on at least a corner lot. So it's a very prominent position. With reference to the bottom left-hand corner image, we see the courthouse and the Anglican church above it. Very strong statements of links to the British Empire. Now, because Rosslyn didn't have an ocean or a river to place over, Rottenberry designed the courthouse to sit within a moat. So it's like a fortified chateau. You can see the entrance to the courthouse, and the bottom is a drawbridge entrance over the moat in the yard, the surrounding yard. Once again, the courthouse uses Richardsonian Romanesque arches, columns, and detailing, as well as the French chateau roof. And then with reference to the next slide, we see terracotta detailing and brickwork, very opulent brickwork detailed. The tower has a fleur-de-lis finial on it, symbolizing the link to French Canada. The idea with the terracotta was to express opulence. By the time the courthouse was built, capital had shifted from from Spokane, investors, which usually had smaller claims. They're all brought up by British interests and Eastern Canada interests. So this is a strong statement of the Canadian establishment now present in Canada, or in Rosslyn. Okay, with reference to the next slide, we see the interior of the courthouse, the entrance and the tiling. And I mean, those are the same tiles used in the Nanaimo courthouse, identical. And then we see, and the entrance hallway is pretty well identical as well in detailing and arches and pilasters and trim, wood trim. The bottom right image is an image of the courtroom with a stained glass window. With reference to the next slide, we see a detail of the stained glass window. The center coat of arms is the BC coat of arms, but the smaller coat of arms to the left is that of Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie, who was a British lawyer, politician, and judge, nicknamed the hanging judge actually. He became the first Chief Justice of the Crown Colony of BC in 1858, or from 1858 to 1870. He served as a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United Colonies. Now that would be the colony of Vancouver Island and the colony of BC from 1870 to 71, mainland BC. Then Chief Justice of BC from 1871, when the two colonies were united, until his death in 1894. His first degree was from Cambridge. Then he studied law at Lincoln's Inn. He had a law office in London, but moved to Fort Victoria in 1858 for his position in government as Chief Justice. He was sworn into office November 16, 1858, as the new colony of BC was proclaimed. He played a key role in 1861, establishing law and order in the new colony through the influx of the 30,000 foreign miners to the Fraser River gold rush at Yale. And at that time, James Douglas, the governor, was very concerned about the American gold miners for two reasons. One was manifest destiny. They were quite an unruly lot, and Canada still hadn't been formed, so that was a serious threat. He was also concerned about the treatment of First Nations, and wars did erupt between First Nations and the foreign miners. So the judge was there to protect them. Bailey played a key role in government drafting legislation such as the Aliens Act of 1859, Goldfields Act of 1859, and Preemption Act of 1860. He repealed the law discriminating against Chinese in 1866. He believed in the Scottish Enlightenment values of egalitarianism when it came to understanding and interacting with the native people. In 1858, during what was called McGowan's War, which was the Law and Order Party versus the Vigilance Committee, Begbie convicted McGowan to prevent conditions in BC from deteriorating into mob rule. Now, these two opposing forces were vigilantes in the Barbary Coast district of San Francisco, and were having turf wars down there. And in the gold rush, they migrated up to Yale and were having battles there. So then the coat of arms to the right of the BC coat of arms is that of Governor James Douglas. He was a Canadian fur trader and politician who became the first governor of the colony of BC. He's widely recognized as the father of BC. At 16 years old, he started work for the Northwest Company, then went over to the Hudson Bay Company when it was absorbed, when the Northwest Company was absorbed. He set up the Hudson Bay Fort in Yerba Buena, San Francisco, in 1839. And then he set up Fort Victoria in 1841 as a second line of forts in case the Columbia River Valley fell into American hands as it did in 1846 with the Oregon Treaty establishing the 49th parallel. From 1851 to 1864, he was the governor of the colony of Vancouver Island. He created Victoria Voltigeurs, Vancouver Island's first militia, using money from the Hudson Bay and sparse protection from the Royal Navy in the face of manifest destiny expansionist pressure on neighboring USA. From in 1858, he became the governor of the colony of BC and asserted British Empire authority during the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush of 1858. He was governor of both colonies until his retirement in 1864. Okay, so that's pretty well an analysis or breakdown of Rossland's architectural history. So we had this very confrontational situation in Rossland in the late 1890s with Americans, with the Western Federation of Miners, the most radical union in America, establishing the Miners Hall in Rossland, and I guess British capital taking over, the Semlin government losing to Dunsmeer in the election of 1900. And Dunsmeer only ran, it's widely accepted, to quash miners and unions in the province, and to ensure Chinese labor at lower rates was still intact. Then in 1901, the Rossland miners went on strike to support locked out smelter workers at Northport and the 8-hour day legislation that had been repealed by Dunsmir, his government. The mine owners brought in strikebreakers from the USA, and the anti-union mayor of Rossland formed an armed militia to protect the strikebreakers and to keep union miners down. The miners' union invited the 26-year-old Deputy Federal Minister of Labor, William Lyon Mackenzie King, to Rossland to enforce the Labor Alien Act. After a week, Mackenzie King was convinced by the mine owners and Rossland's anti-union mayor that the Western Federation of Miners Local 38 was influenced by radical anarchists from the US Western Federation of Miners locals such as Butte and in the Coeur Lane. After the miners voted to return to work in 1902, basically they were starved out. They lasted 9 months, but with the strikebreakers being able to stay there, the alien workers, they just couldn't afford to hold on anymore. During Premier James Dunsmeer's government, mine operators sued the Local 38 for damages and went to trial in the Rosslyn Courthouse. This is in 1902, I believe. Or 1904 by then. The miners' union lost and was ordered to pay $12,500 in damages, forcing it into receivership. The Miners Union Hall was sold to raise funds for the settlement. So, I guess in conclusion, the skirmishes of BC miners during the previous 25 years was now replaced by a harder edge that spread to most regions of the province. A growing socialism among the working class that embraced Marxist doctrines that went beyond reforming capitalism to overthrowing capitalism and through affiliations with new entities such as the industrial workers of the world. And so this presentation has traced the labor movement in the mining camps of the Intermountain West. In its decades of confrontation with industrial capitalism during the Gilded Age, which these years were known, miners had evolved from reformers to radicals to revolutionaries in reaction to corporate interest and collusion with government. This conflict is evident in the architectural symbolism of the Western Federation of Miners Union Hall and BC Provincial Courthouse in Rossland. I hope this presentation has been informative and adds to one's knowledge of the forces that shaped Rossland's urban fabric. So that's the end, just as my voice is running out. So I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Harry. Well, that was interesting. So we have got some time for questions, but I'm going to actually pose the first question because I know you'll want to speak to this pretty much right away, Harry. You had mentioned Francis Rattenbury during doing the Nanaimo courthouse, but he was not, in fact, the architect of the Rosslyn Courthouse. Can you talk a little bit more about the Rosslyn Courthouse architect and what happened there?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I meant to bring that up, but there's a lot of ground to cover, and that's what question periods are for. J.J. Honeyman was a Scottish, they say, contractor. Rossland's done a really good job of interpreting local history with their plaques and heritage information series, wayfinding, things like this. So Honeyman was the contractor, and it's obvious that he was greatly influenced by Rattenbury's Nanaimo Courthouse as a precedent. I don't think, see, Rattenbury, he'd become quite the entrepreneur, being involved with building boats on Lake Bennett in 1898 to ferry Klondike paddle wheelers to ferry miners and supplies to the coal fields in the Klondike. He was involved with financing the Edmonton Brewery. He set up a company to ship frozen salmon to Britain. He was quite active, and he had major contracts as well with CPR at the time and Bank of Montreal. So he was probably very busy, and he either didn't bid, or if he did bid, he felt he could bid high and didn't win the contract. So yeah, that's probably why Rattenbury wasn't present. Well, I do hope it was informative, and we have been discussing, Sarah and I. There's just so much to cover. Doing a walking tour in Rosslyn sometime when the pandemic's over and the sun's out, and yeah, people are off work. We could do a walking tour of the architecture in Rosslyn, and even get into the courtroom and look at the glass and discuss some of the influences on the residential and commercial architecture and institutional architecture of Rosslyn.
Sounds like it is a day-long walking tour. Bring your hiking boots.
Okay.
Yeah, so we are talking about that, and we will keep everybody up to date on when we're planning to do that walking tour. And other than that, we have recorded this talk, and we'll put it up on the Rossland Museum website, so you can continue to share it around and reference it. So thank you so much, Harry. It was a real pleasure, very informative. And thanks everybody for your great questions and for joining us this evening.